And I remember thinking, I wish I could move to LA and go to work for him. And you'll find out why in a little bit. I could take the whole hour talking about his numerous accomplishments, but I'm going to restrict myself to the highlights of his very multifaceted career, as you all know, because you've been reading Law Cal or the posters or Rachel's emails or something. He is now the Los Angeles City Attorney, but he's long been one of California's leading lawyers and lawmakers. As LA's chief lawyer and prosecutor since July 2013, he really has, and this is not hyperbole, done an innovative problem-solving focus to the office. He's focused on neighborhoods, for example, nearly tripling the neighborhood prosecutor program and creating a community justice initiative. He's expanded a project to rid problem properties of gangs, guns, and drugs that threaten neighborhood safety. But he's not just doing that as a prosecutor. He's also settled a landmark civil rights case in which individuals who've been served with gang injunctions will receive job training and the tools to turn their lives around, and not just a jail sentence and the frowns of everybody in their community. Under the city attorney's broad authority, he is sued to protect consumers, litigated against polluters and advanced environmental justice. He's also a national leader in preventing gun violence, started the city attorney's gun violence prevention unit in LA, including prosecuting parents who are careless with their guns so that they end up in the hands of their children. He's joined with our own Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr., to co-found and chair the Prosecutors Against Gun Violence. He's also served a leading role in solving other municipal problems too numerous to talk about. He did have a life before 2013, and I will race through it, even though it's very long. Not his life, but the things he managed to back into it. He was the majority policy leader of the California Assembly and chair of the Assembly's Judiciary Committee, Los Angeles City Council member, executive director of the Beth-Sedek Legal Services, which is one of the nation's leading public interest organizations. So not very many people go from leading a public interest organization to being a major city's leading prosecutor. He's also, I'm not done yet, taught at UCLA School of Law and the UCLA School of Public Affairs, practiced law at two prominent law firms, Hofstadter, Miller, Carson, and Beardsley, and at Morrison and Foster. He's been a commentator on NPR member station KPCC, started his career as a judicial clerk for the California Supreme Court Justice Joseph Grodin, graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College, and a few years later cum laude from its law school. And somehow he finds time to have work-life balance with his wife Gail and two children, Aaron and Danielle. Again, I could have gone on for all of the hour detailing the many accomplishments of Mike Feuer, but I am proud and happy that he's here with us today.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you again. So, am I audible to everybody? Is this on, more or less? Good. All right, so I'm a very informal and direct guy, so I have ground rules, notwithstanding all that informality. Basic ground rule is we're going to have a conversation rather than a lecture. And so I encourage you, if you have any questions as I'm talking, or a comment or a challenge, just to interject. And I will respond to you as candidly as I can. Even though I'm not here to talk specifically as a sort of a career placement matter, I will talk about my office a little bit. But as was said, I've had almost every legal job you can have. And so if you have questions about any facet of those things, because I've been, I've taught, I've been the director of a public interest law firm. I'm a prosecutor now. I'm also a civil litigator. I was the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the state legislature. I've been in a couple of firms. So the point is, I've done all these things. I can compare and contrast if you'd like. So I want to talk to you about what's happening in the world right now. And I'll take you first to LAX, to our airport, about 2 months ago, the night after Trump put in place the first travel ban. And it was an unusual night. About 7 o'clock in the evening, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who said, "Have you been following what's happening on the internet?" And I had not been doing other things all day. You said, "You have to go look." And I could see the chaos that was evolving at airports around the country. And I did a completely unlawyerly thing. At about 8:30 that night, I called. I have security guys from LAPD who go with me places. Said, it's Saturday night, I realize that, but we have to go to the airport. I went there because I wanted to release the detainees who were there. But I had no plan because I'm the city attorney, I'm not a federal official. I didn't know with whom to speak at the airport, didn't know where they worked, had no idea where the detainees were. I hadn't a full understanding of immigration law. That's not normally what's in the wheelhouse of our office. But besides that, I was under control. So we got to the airport, and it was like a movie scene. There's a big terminal, the Bradley International Terminal there. And huge numbers of protesters with signs, chanting, and an open space because they were barricaded off from getting into this basic hallway. And then there are two ramps that were descending from the hallway to the location from which incoming international travelers would emerge, having gone through customs. And many police officers, in fact, law enforcement from, I think, 2 or 3 jurisdictions policing that area in between. So I got there, went through the protesters with my guys, and I asked the law enforcement official to speak to the top federal official there. And this person communicated back to the law enforcement guys, not having any of it. And so I'm there, and I began to negotiate with multiple officials by phone whether I could actually get down to where the detainees were. And the answers kept being, you don't understand, those ramps are not LA territory. My office is the lawyer for the airport. We have an office at the airport. We have a team of prosecutors also at the airport. This is our territory, but no, that's not yours. It was very frustrating. I've never been more angry in my life because I went to the airport that night because, like some of you, I could feel our country slipping away. And I didn't feel any better when I was there. I started to walk down the ramp when I was being blown off. And one of the police chiefs there was there, kind of put his hand on my shoulder and said to me, I'm kind of doing this, get the hand off my shoulder, even though these are my peers, I represent them, I work with them. And I said, sir, please don't put either of us in the position you're about to put us in. I got a phone call as I was walking, some other events intervened that I actually can't talk about, and I decided to pause for a moment. And then maybe 11:50, 11:30 at night, the Homeland Security guy in charge of LAX deigned to meet with me. I learned earlier that previously that day, Congress members had also been just rebuffed and told to go away, seeking to intervene. So I'm talking to the Homeland Security guy, but there's context for that conversation. Again, I'm the city attorney, not something else there. As the protesters are seeing me there, someone recognizes me and they can tell what I'm trying to do, and the chants suddenly change to, let Mike in, let Mike in. It was kind of an extraordinary thing. And a woman who kind of was furiously beckoning me over, yelled at me, I have to talk to you. And so I kind of went over because she was barricaded off, and she said, look, my father has Parkinson's disease. He's among the detainees. I don't think he has his medicine. You have to help. I'm doing this in a much calmer tone than the conversation reflected. So I'm talking to the DHS guy, and I say, are you following what at that point was the one court order emanating from here, actually, which barred deportation of detainees? He said, it's under review. How many detainees do you have? I can't tell you. Under what authority are you holding them? I'm not going to tell you that. I then say, the Constitution isn't just a bunch of words, it matters here, and I recited the experience of this woman who had implored me to help her. He said, I have an airport to run. This is the conversation escalated from here. At some point, I couldn't do anything else. He said, I'm going to have an official of high rank in D.C. call you tomorrow. It's like 2:30 in the morning in Washington. No one's available for me to confer with right now. And the next day, on Sunday, I had a whole team of my office convened prepared to sue the federal government over the travel ban. And almost immediately, because of the time difference, things began to evolve. As I'm sitting there with my team, news comes in, Trump's backed off of green card holders and of visa holders. And then in rapid succession, 3 court orders emanate from elsewhere in the country that essentially put a pause on what's taking place. And that team that was working on those issues in my office is now working on a whole battery of issues I never expected a city attorney to be involved with. For example, police, that's how ICE expresses itself when it goes to the door of someone against whom it wants to enforce on immigration issues. In Los Angeles, police means one thing. It means LAPD. When ICE refers to itself in that manner, it erodes 4 decades worth of community policing by LAPD. Because in Los Angeles, as here, we have a significant population of multiple immigrants, and as a consequence, we try very hard to engender trust with them. And one of our policies is the police department doesn't ask about immigration status when one is a witness or a victim of crime. Well, when ICE does that, messes things up. So I wrote a letter, and I got our mayor and our council president to sign it to ICE, saying change this practice. So far, they haven't been responsive to that. Just yesterday, although I was here for an event I'll talk about in a second, I, over the weekend, grappled with the fact that our Chief Justice, and maybe you heard about this, wrote a letter to Sessions and Kelly saying, stop enforcing at courthouses. Why do I care? Well, in our office, which has broad civil and criminal authority, we prosecute, as was mentioned, among the things that we do. And those prosecutions require us to have witnesses and victims who are cooperative. If you are someone concerned about your immigration status and you think ICE is enforcing at courthouses, you're going to be pretty reluctant to participate in the justice system in civil or criminal context. Our Chief Justice says that, and Sessions and Kelly bat back saying, oh, talk to your governor and other officials there about those sanctuary city policies that you guys have in California that are eroding our immigration enforcement strategies. So I over the weekend, I talked to the Chief Justice, and I talked to our DA, and if you've read the newspaper, you might have seen that a bunch of prosecutors around the state sent a letter to Sessions and Kelly saying, our Chief Justice is right, you're not. In the meantime, we're grappling with the implications of the Sanctuary Cities Executive Order, which, again, because of the lack of definition of sanctuary cities, remains very ambiguous, but also purports to be a threat over the head of cities which don't engage in efforts that the administration seems to think are important. We can talk about those. This is kind of an issue spotting exercise at the beginning of my presentation today. We can return to that. But this is a whole battery of issues about which I had no expectation to be involved when I ran to be the city attorney. So just real quickly, because we're going to get into a whole array of issues, little city attorney 101. So our office has about 925 people in it. We have staff in about 30 offices throughout the city of Los Angeles. We have 3 basic jobs. Our office writes all the laws in the city and advises the mayor and the council and its agencies on every issue that has a legal component to it, which means that our office has every issue in LA that matters. And when I do town hall meetings, as I've done frequently throughout our city, I will talk about, or issues will be presented to me about, homelessness, elder abuse, land use issues, environmental justice, gun violence, airport expansion. You can imagine any issue that has some resonance in a large urban area, we're involved with. Next bucket of things we do is we're involved in civil litigation. We defend the city every time the city is sued, and we sue on behalf of either the people of the state of California, I have special authority to do that, or the residents of the city of Los Angeles, depending upon the issue. In that context, you might have noted, for example, the Wells Fargo litigation. You might have heard about the Wells Fargo case. We brought that case. It has national implications. We have many cases that try to vindicate the rights of consumers, about people who are needing to have environmental justice rights and vindicated in their neighborhoods, a variety of things. We also prosecute. And in that role, I'm trying to have us adopt an approach that places us in a leadership position nationally when it comes to justice system reform. I'm a big believer that the metric of conviction rate is a lazy measure of success, because in our office, we grapple with some very serious crimes and some crimes that erode the quality of life in neighborhoods. We prosecute misdemeanors, but 70% of our cases were charged first as felonies. By the time I finish my first term, which will conclude in about 2 months, we'll have prosecuted about 200,000 cases on my watch. Although that is a smaller portion of our work than our civil work, is still significant. I think we should be focused on, are the neighborhoods that we're working in safer? Are we turning around communities? Those kinds of measures of success, because that's what people really care about. Now, that has led us to be involved in some nationally innovative restorative justice programs, which we can discuss, and other strategies that are community-based efforts to try to engage people in a neighborhood and turn lives around of offenders. We have, for example, a restorative justice program whose recidivism rate is less than 5%. As you might know, nationally, 50, 60% recidivism rates are common. So we're clearly doing something right, and I think that's the more appropriate measure of efficacy. If you reduce recidivism, you're doing two things. You are both making a neighborhood safer because crimes aren't escalating and being repeated, but you're also likely to be doing something with the offender that's going to lead that person's life to be more productive later on. And so we're very into doing those things. So that's kind of the basic, 5-minute background on the scope of our office. Let me drill down a little bit, though, into some of the efforts that we engage in that might resonate with you, because at this moment in our nation's history, the role of the public lawyer, especially the state and local public lawyer, has never been more important. I am trying to redefine the breadth and scope of the office I occupy. I just got reelected. I had no opposition, so I kind of squeaked in just like a couple weeks ago. And as a consequence, I have one more term, we have term limits in LA, to make an imprint that cannot be reversed. So I'm interested in exciting people about joining a place where we can sustain a lot of innovation for the long term. And I'm also interested in raising for you issues that I hope will deeply connect with what you care about the most. When I conduct interviews in our office, and I interview everybody who's going to be a finalist for a job in our office, no matter what their role is, I ask always, why'd you go to law school? And I'm trying, no matter what their age, what their experience level, because I'm trying to get a sense of the values that motivate people who might want to gravitate to our office and try to find ways to fulfill what makes them get up in the morning. I will tell you, and I have this experience both personally and like when I directed that SEDC, we had hundreds of volunteers involved with my program. There is a disjunction very frequently between the reasons people went to law school in the first place and the work they find themselves doing day to day. And that disjunction leads people to have a sense of, their sense of purpose is not being fulfilled to a meaningful degree when that happens. And one of my jobs in all the roles I played as a lawyer and as a lawmaker is to try to get people to get the most out of them by connecting that sense of purpose with their day-to-day work. So in our office, we're pushing lots of envelopes. I mentioned we sue on behalf of the people of the city. So let's get an example like a Wells Fargo. And this is, I hope, the approach that you find other public law offices taking too, but certainly it's ours. There was an article in the LA Times about the alleged practices about, opening fake accounts and such. I told our staff I want us to investigate to see if we can validate those claims, and if we can, then I want us to bring some actions. Unlike some prosecutors in the nation, but almost no civil litigators except for attorneys general, I do not have pre-filing civil subpoena authority in my office. That means that in the Wells Fargo case, we had to do detective work from publicly available documents to validate whether the Times story was accurate. And I had a team to do that. Short parenthetical, because I've been a legislator and I understand what can happen in Sacramento, which is our capital, on Monday, I had a bill up on the floor of the state legislature to give us that subpoena power, which passed one house on Monday, which is very important, and now it's on its way to the other house. Without that subpoena authority, we had to figure out what was going on from lawsuits that have been filed. We were lucky. There were some lawsuits that have been filed, for example, and that led us to some witnesses who prepared to talk to us. And after about a year's worth of investigation, we sued. I had my staff present to me more than once in the course of that year that they were ready to bring the lawsuit. And a couple times I said, not yet, because I wanted us to really get it right. Many of the cases we bring are of great consequence. And this was an example. I knew, and this was actually borne out literally the day that we announced the lawsuit, that our litigation could affect the stock price of one of the leading entities in the country, which means pension funds could go up or down based on our lawsuit. I knew people's jobs could be on the line if we didn't get this right. So I wanted to be sure we did. We filed the suit, and then, as you might, either yesterday or today, Richard Cordray, who's in charge of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is testifying in the House Banking Committee. So we filed the suit. Subsequently, the CFPB and the Comptroller of the Currency for the United States contacted us to say, let's join together on this. And we did. And Cordray, again, I think either yesterday afternoon or today, because their staff communicating with us, is testifying with regard to this collaboration. The collaboration was extremely important. The Republican efforts to either dramatically reduce the scope of authority for the CFPB or eliminate it altogether are completely wrong-headed. I have authority in the state of California. The ability of our case to have national resonance was contingent on the collaboration among our office, the OCC, and the CFPB, which, because of their national authority, were able to bring to bear the force of this lawsuit and affect consumers across the country. That's the kind of effort I want our office to be engaged with frequently. So we work in collaboration with the Attorney General, with private public interest law firms and others to try to vindicate rights that have no one else to champion them. That's the key reason I ran for this job, actually, despite everything else we do. Having been a public interest lawyer, I know the power of the law to step in and enable us to stand up for people. That's what I want our office to be doing. I'm going to pause just for a moment and then return to some themes for a second. Let me ask you, in this room, how many of you have through some introspection, decided in the wake of what's happening nationally to reevaluate your career path? Anybody? Yeah. So, and by that I mean maybe you were headed for a law firm and decided, well, maybe that's not the best use of my brain power right now. Or maybe you were headed to DOJ and in DC and decided, well, I'm not sure I want to be in that context now. I want to emphasize to you that there is a moment in time, maybe a few moments in your life, where you'll have to, through some pretty deep thinking, identify what it is that really matters to you the most. And I want to say, outside the context of discussing policies, I will in a moment, I think it's really critical that you take risk. Not recklessly, but the only things that I found in my life that have really propelled forward stuff I've wanted to do involve taking meaningful risk. As was mentioned, I used to run this public interest law firm. I was very young. I was 28 when I was asked to be in charge of this firm that had 50,000 cases. They made a really lousy choice, but it worked out okay. So I'm there, and we have two kids. My wife was then the senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council in Los Angeles, and I'm running Betzetic. We had very little money. We had two kids and a mortgage, and the city councilman for the district in which I was located ran for a different job, opening up a very powerful seat in Los Angeles. And I quit my job. And I walked door to door for 7 months. Risk. Could have turned out very badly, but it was a moment in time that I thought wasn't going to return. At this moment in time, I suspect you are thinking, well, I look back on what's happening now and say, I was a spectator, and wonder whether that's really who you want to be when you're reflecting on what you did with your life when you're 76 years old. Spectatorship, not so exciting. And I have that view pretty intensely when I think about the work of our office. Again, whether it be justice reform, dealing with issues of what kind of communities we want to run and all the immigration issues that are out there, standing up for consumers, filling in a gap that's being created by the retraction, the retrenchment by the EPA from important environmental protections, our office can fill a lot of those roles. It's a little presumptuous, you might say, for a city's lawyer to be filling in those roles. Okay, I'll own up to that, maybe so. But that we can do. And again, I think we demonstrated it a lot. So let me talk a little bit more about each of the categories of work that I mentioned and the national context in which we find ourselves. And let's talk a little bit about the Trump administration and a city like Los Angeles for a moment. I talked about the travel ban, which you might think is beyond the scope of what a city official would like to be involved in, but as you might imagine, everything from tourism to the rights of people who traverse our streets day to day are deeply implicated by that travel ban. The sanctuary city issue, that term doesn't really mean that much. It's kind of a definitionless term right now. In fact, our city has asked Kelly for a definition, and so far he said, I don't know what it is exactly. But let's presume for a moment it means a city whose police force doesn't inquire about immigration status. Or a city, do you know what detainers are in the immigration context? Let me just describe to you for a second. It's a very simple term, but it's an issue around the country right now. Our police department has somebody it's holding, and they're going to be released. ICE says, please detain them. We're issuing you a detainer to you so that they'll be there when we come pick them up. Beyond the time, please hold them beyond the time that you'd otherwise release them. So the question is that something we should do? And the answer is, well, a couple courts have already opined that actually honoring an ICE detainer without a judicial order accompanying it violates the civil rights of the detainee, subjecting the jurisdiction potentially to litigation. So far, our city says we're not going to honor detainers that don't have judicial imprimatur attached to them. By contrast, you might have seen this discussion has resulted in the county of Miami-Dade saying, we give, and we're going to honor detainers now. Because the specter that the administration has created is, if you, in some manner, don't collaborate with the federal government in ways that we deem appropriate on immigration issues, we're going to restrict or take back funds that have been attributed to you through the budget process. Now, this requires an office like ours to work on many cylinders at the same time. For example, we have to understand the rules around congressional appropriations, the constitutional principles that are at stake when funds that have been allocated are sought to be taken back, what the rules are surrounding what Congress can do prospectively to attach riders to legislation to restrict what the recipient can be doing and to compel them to do certain things. Suddenly we're into, what does the 10th Amendment mean in the context of the daily life of a city as complex as Los Angeles? And then there are deep political issues that transcend the legal ones. What ought we be doing? Because the lawyer's job isn't always to define what the practice or policy is of his or her client. Sometimes to say, here are your options as to what you can be doing. What do you want to do? When I was contemplating suing the Trump administration the Sunday morning after having been at the airport, there are implications to such litigation. Because, of course, there are grants that are purely discretionary that can be given out or not, as the case may be. So these are some of the issues that I have teams in my office looking at right now. One thing about our job is it's hard to know what to expect day to day, which makes it very interesting as well as challenging to grapple with. As I think about the administration of justice, the reason I was conferring closely with, because I ran the Judiciary Committee, I have strong relationships with judges, including a good one with the Chief Justice of our state. What ought the administration of justice be in our state? How does that relate to immigration practices? There was a letter to the editor in the LA Times today from actually the justice for whom I clerked back a while ago, supporting the Chief Justice's effort to try to assure that courts and courthouses are not the locations where ICE conducts immigration enforcement. The second letter to the editor came from someone who said, well, wait, the Chief Justice isn't talking about a legal issue in a case. She's talking about a policy issue. This is beyond the scope of her authority. She has no place having this conversation. Well, where should our office fall in that discussion? I'm here in New York, shifting gears for a second, but trying to identify, again, the scope of things that might interest you in this very complicated moment in our nation's history. Because, as was mentioned, I co-chair and co-founded an organization called Prosecutors Against Gun Violence. We have this robust civil role, but this prosecutorial role we mentioned as well. And I did that based on some very specific facts. When I was a state legislator, I had experience, as every lawmaker does, with the fact that when there's a bill that comes before you, typically at every house from Congress to Albany, you get a piece of paper from your caucus for each bill. Here's the bill, here's what it says. Here's the essence of what it does. Here's who's for it. Here's who's against it. And here's what your caucus thinks you should be doing on the bill. And you could just be kind of a non-thinking person and just follow that recommendation and vote as your caucus wants to. But in that context, I recognized an important fact about the support and oppose list. When Democrats assess supporters and opponents, they may care about what the Sierra Club or the Brady campaign think about an issue more. When Republicans assess the list, the Chamber of Commerce or the Manufacturers Association might matter to them more. But for both Republicans and Democrats, prosecutors matter. And having written most of the city's toughest laws on gun violence in a couple of the states, now in this role as a prosecutor, I called Cy Vance here and said, why don't we form the nation's first ever coalition of prosecutors focused on gun violence prevention? Again, beyond the sort of job description of city attorney per se, but there's this space that was vacant in public life. The voice of prosecutors hadn't coalesced around gun violence issues before. And I'm here because on Monday and Tuesday we had the 5th summit of this organization. It was now about 2.5 years old, of prosecutors purposely, geographically very diverse. We had prosecutors from Savannah and Memphis, as well as Seattle and Portland here. Democrats, Republicans, North, South, East, West, Midwest. Very important to convey the sense that there are some elements of gun violence policy that ought to be governed not by slogan alone, but by facts on the ground. Prosecutors know those facts. We're charged with keeping our communities safe. And in fact, what happened yesterday is we stood with a group that was led by a New York legislator, because there's now a state lawmakers group parallel to ours. I forget the precise title, but basically American state lawmakers for gun violence prevention. And yesterday we announced that they're introducing bills at the state level in a couple different substantive areas in 20 different locations. And our prosecutors are going to stand with them to try to propel those bills to the finish line. The substance of those bills emerges from what scientists tell us, which is where I want our group to be. Evidence-based data should motivate our policy in many areas. And in this one, what does the evidence tell us? The most likely times that someone's going to engage in gun violence. The science of risk tells us something about this. People who might temporarily be dispossessed of their guns because they just got a domestic violence TRO against them, or because they've had a mental health episode and ought to be temporarily dispossessed of weapons while things work out. So our office, I hope, is a catalyst in many cases for national policy change and part of a laboratory of ideas about how policy and law intersect in our country. So I'm going to pause for a second, because I've been talking a lot, and I want to be sure I can keep talking, I can ask you questions, but do you have any questions for me before I go on?
So one request, this is being taped, so please use the mics, even though you undoubtedly could be heard without them. The people in the future will not hear you unless you use the mic. Yeah.
Okay, obviously Pizza Stupor has said in. Oh, thank you. Good.
So I know that one of the issues following the immigration orders here that many public defenders raised was hoping that prosecutors here would maybe step off the gas a little bit on broken windows policing or policing for small crimes, because once those people are captured by the criminal justice system, they are then exposed to ICE. And I was wondering if your office had a similar thought or a similar strategy.
It's a great question. What's your first name?
Olivia.
Let's be sure. That was Olivia who just said that. It's an extremely important issue, and it's very complicated. So our city council has reacted, Olivia, in a way that reflects what you're talking about, by moving to decriminalize what had been illegal vending in our city. Los Angeles is a city in which many immigrants vend on the street, fruit, meat, other things. And that is not lawful in our city. There have been many legislative efforts to grapple with what to do about that, none successful yet. And so it's no longer a misdemeanor to do that. The council may take other steps involving other issues. From my standpoint, and that's fine, what's complex about that is, depending upon the nature of the offense, there's a reason why the matter was a criminal offense in the first place, and every community deserves to be a safe place. And I do subscribe to the notion that as crimes are committed in a way that visibly erodes the quality of life in a neighborhood, it creates a sense of license for other crimes to be committed like that. I think there are limits to the validity of that theory, but there is something to it. And I'm very concerned in Los Angeles, like many places, LA is both racially but certainly economically both a very diverse and a very segregated city at once. And I'm very concerned that the quality of life in many neighborhoods in our city and public safety in those neighborhoods is lousy, and that's not fair. So there are many balances to strike as we evaluate what to do when offenses are committed. We don't unilaterally decide whether someone should be charged or arrested, right? That's a police function. We get the referral from them and then have to decide what to do with the referral. We certainly require that those referrals be based on solid evidence before we take any step whatsoever. We certainly grapple with the broad implications of a prosecution in every instance. But we haven't said, after we get a legitimate referral on a misdemeanor case that otherwise we would file, we haven't said, well, we're not going to file that case because of the person's potential immigration status, about which we are ignorant, by the way, because no one has asked up to that point. But we're in the middle of that discussion internally. Are there steps we should be taking to rethink that a little bit? It's something that we are self-consciously involved in now, and in conversation with policymakers who define what the laws are in our city. But again, it is not an easy question, because the implication of the question on some level could be, not yours, but the general conversation could be, well, these crimes don't matter really, so why are we putting people in a bad position by pursuing them? And I don't think in most cases that premise is accurate. So there are tough choices to be made. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Eugene, and my question is, you've really emphasized on the importance of coalition between city attorneys throughout the nation. I'm just wondering whether similar opportunities exist for similar collaboration between city attorneys and state attorney generals to broaden the scope of the current efforts and some of the work that you're doing.
Yes, they clearly do. For example, very soon after he was appointed, I met with our Attorney General and have conferred, I don't think it's a great secret, we have conferred about the issues that some of the nationwide immigration-related issues. We also have some legal work we're doing on other kinds of cases where we confer. For example, we've had preliminary conversations about, we sued the gas company in Southern California over this methane leak you might have heard about, the most significant gas leak in the history of the country. And the Attorney General's office under now Senator Harris joined our lawsuit eventually, and now we are collaborating on that case. So there are many other instances too where our offices do need to be working together. Like with the CFPB example, there is a tremendous leveraging opportunity to the benefit of consumers and neighborhoods and so forth when we do that. So yeah, I'm a fan. I mean, I will say, but as you develop in your careers, you'll recognize collaboration is always an important thing to do, but it also complicates every piece of litigation because suddenly decisions need to be made together. And one might have different points of view regarding decision making. Democracy is a messy thing in any context, and it's also the case in that setting that it's true. There's a lot of give and take that otherwise wouldn't be required from unilateral action. But yeah, no, I'm a fan of that kind of teamwork. And I certainly, again, I want to return to the Wells Fargo example because the CFPB's existence is threatened by the example of the case that we engaged in, at least from some Republican standpoint. It is such a lousy idea to say just because a local jurisdiction pursued something in the first place that the efficacy of the federal level is somehow in question because local guys did it first. That's a silly theory. But it has implications right now for the nation's leading consumer protection organization, which I strongly support. Other questions?
My name is Clarissa, and I wanted to ask, I know you've had work with both nonprofits and organizing, and now as in legislatures or an attorney, what made you move into those different sectors? I think a lot of us have a lot of choices, and we're trying to understand what our interests are and how they would best benefit others. So I don't know how you made that decision for yourself.
It's a great question, too. And I'm very pleased you asked it, because it reflects a recognition that isn't always true. I mean, I look around this room, you have all worked incredibly hard and achieved great things, and it's an obvious point, but it can't be said frequently enough, are exceptionally privileged to be here. The privilege that I'm talking about most is you have choices. Most people in the world don't have career choices that leads them to think, what matters to me the most? It's how can I eat is the fundamental question, right? You have the luxury. So what do you do with that exactly? I'm from San Bernardino, a place most people hadn't heard about until the horrible tragedy that occurred there. But it's a very working class community. It went into bankruptcy not long ago. Tough place in some ways. And so I grew up in a very unentitled context, but a middle class one. My dad was a school teacher and then a school principal there. But I want to talk kind of personally about that for a second. Perhaps I would be better off lying on a couch while you take notes to this. It's going to require, but consider this a very inexpensive therapy session for me. So, but all kidding aside, my dad died last year, about a year and a quarter ago. He and I were very close, and when I was a kid, I was very athletic, and my father was very into sports, and I one of my favorite things was to pitch to him on like Saturday afternoon. So we were doing one of those daddy-son experiences where I was pitching as I was a young high school student, and throwing it as hard as I could. And my dad began telling me in more detail than he had previously what it was like to be a prisoner of war to the Nazis in World War II. My dad, and you'll forgive the very personal digression, but it's deeply tied to the answer to your question. My dad was a turret gunner in a B-24 bomber. If you know anything about World War II history, if this is I have visual aids. If someone asked earlier, do I have visual aids? This is my visual aid. So if this is the nose of the airplane, there's a little ball turret underneath the B-24. And it's a little glass ball in which one guy was housed with some machine guns to fend off oncoming Nazi fighter pilots. And that was my dad's job. And my dad enlisted, actually, to do that work. So he's in that turret and flying on what was to be, I think, the last mission of his team before the crew was to be sent home. And they were shot down over the south of France. Kind of a funny story my dad told. For some reason, they never taught my dad, or his peers, I guess, about how to parachute. He had never parachuted before. So the plane is going down, and he can't even get out of the turret without the guys in the plane being cognizant that he's there and having the presence of mind to turn the turret around from the inside so he can come back into the airplane and then jump. So my dad says he pulled the ripcord of the parachute, and apparently a little chute comes out, then the big one comes out. So he pulls it, and he sees this little tiny parachute come out. And my dad said, oh my God, I got the kid's parachute. But then the other thing came out. So he's descending to the ground, and he sees a guy with a beret in the south of France on a bicycle. He's thinking, great, I'm going to land, and the resistance is going to find me and protect me. Just the opposite. He lands, the guy was helping the Nazis, bullets are firing around him, and he's captured and taken to Stalag 17. You're probably too young, but your parents will remember a movie called Stalag 17. They made a very famous movie about the prisoner of war camp where my dad was located. We're Jewish. Being Jewish in a Nazi prisoner of war camp was a horrible thing, without details now. At the end of the war, the Russians are coming to liberate the camp. And they and the Nazis had a brutal relationship. The Nazis picked up the camp to run from the Russians. My dad, because of injuries and because he had no boots that would fit him, couldn't walk. And so he said, picture a long line of POWs marching across the entire nation of Austria in the snow. And my dad about a half mile behind them with a guard and a machine gun and a German Shepherd. He said, that guy could have shot me. No one would have heard the sound. I was so far behind. I'm pitching. He's telling me some of this more granular than I'm going to describe to you now. And he says, and I said to him, why'd you choose your job, which was the catalyst for this? Because my dad was a ferociously brilliant guy, could have made a lot of money. And he said, when we were liberated from that, I wasn't supposed to survive that experience, obviously. Everything was wrong. And somehow I did. And I decided to do the most important work in the world at that point, at 21 and a half. And for him, having seen what war was about, the work was kids. Gotta change the future for kids. So he became an educator, a teacher, and then a school principal. So we finished pitching, but there's obviously a lesson for me, I can tell, in that discussion. Find the most important work you can do. And at bottom, for me, my career, yet unfinished, is really about what the most important work is that I have the ability to get into. And I've been searching. What does that mean exactly? My chief of staff says I'm kind of a tormented soul. That's her terminology, and I think she means that in a positive way because she's still my chief of staff. Because I'm always trying to push and prod and find something even more important to be doing. I mean like in our office. Let's try this. So I was very lucky to, I'll just tell you my career path. So I'm clerking on the Supreme Court in California, and then I work at a law firm to which I went because, I'll just do real quick why I chose each thing. When I was clerking, I was told, this is a law firm in LA, one of the principal partners had been education secretary under President Carter. She was a female secretary in an administration, very rare. The first African-American partner bar in a law firm in downtown was in the firm. He turned down a Supreme Court appointment to be there. The first female bar president. A lot of people like this are in this firm. And one of the other justices said to me, you want to do public work in LA? It's a private firm, but you'll find a way to do it there. And I did a lot of pro bono work there, but I was only there for a year and a half when Tom Bradley, who was then the mayor of Los Angeles, sought to be the first African-American governor in the history of California. And that partner, I mentioned, was his best friend. He asked me if I could take a leave from the firm and be in charge of issues and research for the Bradley campaign. So I was very flattered. I decided to do that. In the middle of that temporary leave from the firm, a guy who had been in charge of this place called Bed-Stuy had just won a state legislative seat, and he was kind of famous. And I was a kid, and some people at Bed-Stuy called and said, after the campaign, you want to come run Bed-Stuy. And I thought that was an insane idea at the time, because I had very little experience, obviously. But to do that was the fulfillment of many of the reasons that motivated me to turn to law school as a place to get trained in the first place. So I said that would be fabulous. So I ran Bed-Stuy, and I taught at the law school during the same period of time. But after a while, I was there for 8 years as a director. We did a lot of great things, including impact litigation and legislative advocacy. But the legislative advocacy bugged me in some ways, because I was always pleading with someone else to please do X, Y, or Z, as I was in court, as our team was in court. So I decided to run when the city council seat opened up that I referred to a moment ago, so I could be the decision-making guy rather than the urging guy. And I will talk about risk for a second. So I'm in the council. I'm in charge of the budget for the city council. Lots of great things were happening. I'm just very successful. And I get reelected. No one opposed me when I ran for reelection. And then the city attorney's job opened up in 2001. And I thought, okay, let me try to do that. In Los Angeles, the odd-numbered city council seats are up at the same time as the citywide. There are 3 citywide office holders, the mayor, the city attorney, and the controller of the city. I represented the 5th council district. If I'd been in the 4th district, I could have retained my position and run simultaneously and returned to my job, didn't win. But I was the 5th district guy. So I ran for city attorney. I won the primary, but I had to give up my seat to run. I wrote a law, among many, but a law to get rid, it will seem kind of, I'm not sure how big a deal with it to you now, but it was an above-the-fold LA Times story then, to get rid of billboards that advertise alcohol and tobacco where kids live in Los Angeles. The reason I did was a bunch of moms, almost exclusively Spanish-speaking moms, implored me on my public safety work to get those billboards out of their neighborhoods because they thought they were being concentrated in their neighborhoods to direct their kids, to inspire them to smoke and drink, which they thought were avenues toward other more dangerous activity. And so I wrote this law, big deal, national thing, and the billboard companies brought the biggest donation in the history of Los Angeles up to that point. There were billboards everywhere from my opponent because whoever won that election was going to enforce the law that I'd just written. And I won the primary, but I narrowly lost the election. Only thing in my life at that point that I really wanted that didn't happen. But it was a big thing not to happen. And I had to remake my life. And in terms of risk, I think that was another risk moment. I chose to risk things, but suddenly I had no job. And I had to evaluate what mattered to me and what was available. And I went to Morrison and Forster. I set up, right after 9/11, my deal was I want to spend half my time working for free. That's my ask. And they said, okay. So I went there and I taught at the public affairs school, and I was on NPR, and I had that job. And I thought, this should make somebody happy, right? Half my time I worked on the major education case in the history of the state about giving poor kids equal access to education stuff, and I'm making enough money to get by, and I'm on the air, and I'm teaching, and my daughter, who's now a second-year law student elsewhere at Yale, said, you were a grump. And the kids say true things to their parents. And I think what she meant is kind of what I was referring to before, that my sense of purpose was at odds with at least some of the stuff I was doing every day. And because I was also a commercial litigator, which I thought I was doing well, but the outcome wasn't interesting to me. So I decided to go back and run for state assembly. And I purposely sought out positions that were very, that had deeply involved in shaping major policy in the state. I purposely wanted to be the Judiciary Committee chair, get involved in that stuff. And then I took another risk. I ran to be city attorney against an incumbent. And no incumbent had lost in 40 years in Los Angeles. And it was a brutal campaign, very unfun, but I won. So kind of at each turn, and I thought, because I wanted to do the things we're talking about here, all these, I could see the potential in an office that wasn't fulfilling all this potential. But it's not an easy job. It's a very hard job, actually. But so a little incident, kind of each choice was sort of, where can I make an impact? Can I be involved with people who are at the cutting edge of things? Can I try to vindicate rights of people who get screwed all the time? Can I try to be in a power position as opposed to a begging position in some instances? Can I try to push the envelope of what an office that had been kind of constrained and make it totally different? Different motivations. Forgive the long answer, but each step along the way for me has involved a significant amount of rethinking about my own priorities and then testing the limits of the job that I'm occupying. So we're almost done time-wise. I have another 7 or 8 minutes. Other questions? So I can turn to you and ask questions. Let me say a couple other things before we conclude. So I do think, because it's funny because I'm used to being the young guy in the room. When I ran Beth-Sedec, I was younger than the secretaries were. And people were really, when I first got there, I will tell you, I remember, it's not very important, but I feel like saying it anyway. So I get there, and I'm so excited because I went to law school to pursue social justice, and here I am. That's all this group does. So I go to the library, I convene all the staff, I describe my aspirations, how great it is. As I'm walking out, I can hear a couple of the veteran lawyers speaking a little too loudly, saying to each other, oh, well, that was great. It's going to be, this guy's just a kid, right? Things change very dramatically there. But still, I'm used to being kind of the young guy. When I was on the city council, I was the young guy on the city council, and so on, or one of the two young guys. Now, I'm not. Now I've been through this path, and now I'm kind of in the middle of everybody. That gives me a little perspective on what's happening now nationally. I think, I lived through the time of Watergate, although I was in school at the time. This is more tumultuous than even the resignation of a president of the United States. To me, the basic principles on which our nation is founded are at stake in decision after decision. And there are no grown-ups in the room, it seems. There's a lot of license, a lot of space being given to allow an increasingly authoritarian approach to be taken by the executive, and that's not what our nation is. So much of how I reflect on the scope of our job now in my office and the role of lawyers, and that includes law students around the country, is what can we do, as I said a moment ago, to step in, both to fill a space created by a retreat from protections on consumer issues, on environmental issues, on civil rights issues, and so on. How are we going to occupy that space as the federal government backs off? And second, what are we going to do to defend what makes our nation distinctive? And I said before, and I will say it again, you do not want to look back and say, I watched. Because right now, you have tools. I mentioned my daughter's at Yale. It was kind of a funny thing. At the, as I'm headed to the airport, now it's like almost 9 o'clock at night, I don't know when you call your parents to say hello. My daughter calls around midnight, because then things are done for the day. So she calls to say hi, just as I'm leaving. And I say, I can't really talk to you right now. I'll call you from the car. And she says to me, well, actually, there are some students at Yale working right now on an issue like this. And so like at 3 in the morning, New Haven time, I'm talking to the guy in charge of a clinic there, one of the professors there, and students about some of the principles we're trying to grapple with on the ground at that moment in our city. You have right now skills that are directly relevant to what's going on in the world on all those issues, including not just the highfalutin federal immigration case law stuff, but on the ground right now. You have the tools already. So you need to use them. And as you think about what it means to step into those roles, I wanted to share with you, I do not know, I cannot tell you that I have defined with specificity what the moment is when our office is going to step in to intercede, to fill those gaps I mentioned. Because there are so many things happening right now. Setting priorities as a lawyer, as a public official, and in your personal lives is sort of the key to everything. And that requires saying no to some moments, as well as yes to some moments. You're a finite resource. You have to decide the opportunity costs in making this choice versus that choice. And we're doing that all the time in my office. Where do we just back off and say someone else is doing it or not? So sometimes, for example, in these cases, we are among the amici, as opposed to in the forefront of handling the case. Sometimes we're in the forefront. It depends. But this is the stuff of what it's like to be in a public law firm right now, is to be making the choices I'm describing, defining where our limited resource can be devoted to its highest and best use, and trying to find ways, while all this is happening, for me to create a public law firm whose values 5 years from now will reflect what matters most now in terms of how we recruit and who we hire and what the kind of priorities they have and so on are. So last question or two, and then we'll call it a day. We're out of time. Okay. So may I say, I really appreciate your taking the time to be here. This is a moment to matter. And I hope you all take up that challenge in some facet of your lives immediately. Thanks very much.